Welcome to the pumpkin insert for our subscription box that we have for our baskets. We're going to get started here with some Florida orange, terracotta, cotton, kudzu, barn red, and chocolate. You're also going to want some sponges, brushes if you have them. Gorilla Glue is what I use for my preferred glue. It's a super glue. Some scissors to cut the ends off of your sponges, and a paint palette. I like to stick all of my little pieces to some painter's tape that's flipped upside down into a loop on my table. Stick them down so they don't run away on me. I'm going to go ahead and sort all my little pieces by color. So the ones on the left-hand side are all going to be green. The little acorns on the right are going to be brown. And then the leaves are going to be kind of a mixture of a couple different colors. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the terracotta. When it comes to the pumpkins, it depends on your personal preference. You can either use terracotta or Florida orange, whichever you prefer. I like to start with a little bit of terracotta and get a nice base coat on all of my pumpkins before I start going in with some Florida orange. Just dabbing straight up and down with my sponges. If you don't have sponges, brushes are perfectly fine. The only thing you'll need to watch with the brushes is you may lose the lines that are giving the detail on your pumpkins. If you use brushes, the paint may end up filling in those lines. Whereas if you use sponges, it typically glides right over top of the lines. Just need to make sure you're dabbing off any excess paint before you go to your workpiece. Make sure there's not too much paint on your sponge, or it may end up filling in those lines. Now that I have some of my pumpkins as the terracotta orange, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the Florida orange. Mixing up the shades of the orange a little bit just to give all the pumpkins a little bit of definition. You don't want all of your pumpkins to be the same color. Another option for your pumpkins, if you wanted to, is you could also use the kudzu or the cotton. Every once in a while in a pumpkin patch, you'll see either a green or a white pumpkin. You can always use those as accent colors on your pumpkins as well, as if they almost didn't, ripen all the way, if you wanted to add some realism to it. Doing the same technique with the Florida orange, just dabbing off a little bit of my sponge. I didn't worry about cutting the end of my sponge on this one because I'm using oranges. So if a little bit of the terracotta comes through it, that's not a big deal. And it looks like I didn't frame this video very well, so down there at the bottom, I'm just working on the rest of the pumpkins. There are 2 loose pumpkins, so that's just one of them. Just putting a little bit of orange on it, same way as I did all of the other pumpkins, so I promise you're not missing out on a whole lot because it's not in frame. I'm going to use a little bit of the cotton. And we're just going to use that as a little bit accent line. So I'm still using a dirty orange sponge. Just going to dab a little bit of the cotton onto it, the white. And I'm going to dab it through my mess that I've made with my oranges. I don't want it to be a super bright white. I want it to be more of a muted orange with a little bit of white added to it. And I'm just going to use that as a little bit of highlighting on the sides of my pumpkins. I ended up putting on just a smidge bit too much of that white. So now I'm going back through with a little bit of Florida orange just to kind of mute it a little bit. I don't want it too bright, just a little bit to give it some highlighting. And don't worry about if you cross across the line, that's going to be for the stem. When you go back through with the chocolate to paint the stem, it's going to cover that up. So there I've dipped my sponge in a little bit of white and a little bit of the terracotta. And I'm going to blend the 2 colors together and use it for accent on my terracotta pumpkins. I'm really just playing with all the colors on these pumpkins. I don't want them to be too flat and too two-dimensional. So I'm just adding in a little bit of highlighting with different shades of white and orange and just kind of playing with it until they look the way I want them to. So for this part, I'm just going to be going back and forth with a little bit of the white, a little bit of the terracotta, a little bit of the Florida orange. Just kind of playing around with the colors, seeing what I like. Making some new colors, just different shades of oranges. Smoothing out some of the accent lines I'm working on. Adding some terracotta to some of my Florida orange pumpkins, give it some darkness to it, a little bit of highlighting. Just trying my best to make these look not quite so two-dimensional. Switching over to some of the chocolate brown, we're going to do a little bit of shading on the pumpkins with the brown. Once we have a little bit of brown, still using my dirty sponge, it's got oranges on it, I'm going to dip a tiny bit into the brown. And I'm just going to put a little bit of, almost like there's dirt on the bottoms of my pumpkins. Just following the bottom line of that front pumpkin, being careful not to put it into the other pumpkin. Just adding a little bit as if there's a little bit of dirt there, blending it in. And doing the same thing on the pumpkin next to it. Still playing with a little bit of the different oranges, just to get the look that I'm looking for. With the brown, it is a very dark color, and it's going to overpower your oranges, so a little bit goes a long way. Just putting it on the bottom side of that pumpkin. Putting my pieces together so I can kind of see what they're looking like and see if I want to make any changes. Adding a little bit of white to kind of tone down that brown. And don't be afraid to use your fingers to kind of blend the colors a little bit too. Using my nice dirty sponge with all the colors on it now and just adding a little bit to this pumpkin, giving it some different colors on it. Putting my pumpkins off to the side while I think about if I want to add any more to them. Go ahead and use the same dirty sponge. It's got all the oranges on it. And we're going to go ahead and do the leaves. As you know, leaves don't usually have just one color on them. So I'm putting down some brown and not caring if there's a little bit of orange on it. Adding a little bit more of the orange to it, just to give it a little bit of variation of colors. Using my orange and brown mixture for the next leaf. Then going ahead with a little bit more brown on the next leaf. In your kit, you also have a little bit of the barn red. As you know, some leaves can be orange, they can be red. So I'm just adding a tiny, tiny bit of the barn red just to break it up so not everything on here is going to be just brown and orange. Wanted to add a little bit more color to them, so I'm adding a little bit of red to my leaves just to kind of break up all of the brown and orange. Once I'm happy with the way the leaves look, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my little acorns, push the pumpkins out of the way, make some room. And for these little acorns, we're going to use the chocolate, and you can use the sponge for them. But for these in particular, I decided to use a tiny brush. I'm going to dip my brush into some water, have a nice damp brush. So basically I have a little bit more water than I do have paint on my brush. And I'm going to go ahead and paint very lightly over top of my acorns, giving it a little bit of a natural variation there as the paint runs out on my brush. So as you can see, it's a little bit darker towards the top than it is towards the bottom. Adding more water to my brush, I'm going to go ahead and do it on the next one. Starting at that top piece there, working my way down. And as I work down, I'm losing paint in my brush and ended up with more water, giving it that lighter effect just kind of naturally. Doing the same thing on the last acorn. Just going through in my watered down paint. Giving it some natural shadowing right there. Then I'm going to go ahead and paint all of the stems on my pumpkins with the same chocolate brown and the same tiny paintbrush. Now that I've had some time for my little acorns, or actually they're probably pine cones now that I look at them. Yep, they're pine cones, not acorns. All right, so now that I've had some time for my pine cones to dry a little bit, I'm going to go through with a little bit more of paint just to kind of darken up that top half of it to give it a little bit more shadowing. I'm just kind of painting inside the lines a little bit, the closer to the top I am, and then feathering out on my way down. Then next, just to add a little bit of highlighting to it, I'm going to take a clean sponge. I'm going to put a little bit of white on the front half of it, a little bit of brown on the back half of it. So I have a split sponge. You can see it's got white and brown on it. I'm going to dab it and blend the two colors together, making the top of my sponge more of a tannish kind of color, not necessarily white. And I'm just going to use that to add just a tiny, tiny bit of highlighting to my pine cones. Just want a tiny, tiny bit of an offer color, more of a tan kind of color, not quite white. And while I have a little bit of that off-white color, I'm just going to add a smidge of it just to the tips of my leaves to give them a little bit of highlighting. Next, we're going to work on the last pieces we have. Those pieces are going to be the kudzu green. Using a new sponge that's clean, we're going to dip just a little bit into the green. Get a nice full coverage on these pieces. Once we've finished with the green, we're going to add just a tiny bit of the white down to one of the corners. Again, we don't really want it to necessarily be white, more so of a lighter green. And we're just going to add a little bit of highlighting to one side of these leaves. And once my hand moves out of the way, you can see what I'm getting at here. So just adding a little bit of highlighting to the leaves, just so they're not a plain, boring green. Now that I've had some time to take a look at my pumpkins, and I have a little bit of green on my sponge, I decided to add a little bit of green to my pumpkins. Not gonna lie, I was a little worried about what this was gonna look like, but if you've ever attended any of my workshops, you always know that I say, it's just paint. If we don't like it, we can go over top of it. So I added a little bit of green, and here I am with a little bit of orange, trying to tone that green down. Using just a tad bit of water and blending my pumpkin and making sure I'm going with the curvature of the pumpkin. So I'm going up and down from top to bottom. Just blending a little bit of that green. The water is going to have the paint move a little bit more than the sponge would. So just adding a little bit of water and kind of blending the green a little bit. Adding a little bit more orange and just playing with the colors until I get it back the way I wanted it to be. Still playing with the colors a little bit. Make sure I'm staying with the curvature of the pumpkin. Using my sponge, just adding a little bit of a color to the sides. Using the white end of that white and green sponge. Just adding a little bit of the highlighting back that I kind of erased when I was trying to fix the green. Now that I'm all done with my pieces, I'm going to use the extra fine white, it's a Posca paint pen. They're available in a multitude of different brands. We sell them here in store, and I believe they are also available on our website. And just adding a little bit of accent lines to my pumpkins, just to break it up a little bit. Doing a mix of lines and a couple dots, adding some lines to the stems. And I'm going to make sure that all of my pieces have a little bit of accent lines to them, just to give them some pizzazz. Now that I've put all the accent lines on all of my pieces, I'm going to go ahead with some assembly. You're going to use whatever glue that you have. Like I said, I prefer the Gorilla Glue. It's a super glue, and it holds fairly quickly. So make sure you have your piece in place where you want it to be, as there's not a whole lot of working time with it typically. Going to go ahead and add the 2 pumpkins to the front, making sure I have the correct pumpkins and that everything lines up correctly. And then on this front pumpkin, it's going to have the leaves. The leaves are going to overhang a smidge, so you're only going to put glue on the back side, on the top of the back side of those leaves. Depending on the type of glue you have, you may want to hold that for a while just to make sure that it doesn't slide. Then your next piece is going to be one of the pine cones. The main thing with this pine cone is to make sure that its little stem area does not go past the tab on the front of those pumpkins. If it goes past the tab, then your pumpkins aren't going to sit correctly into the basket. So just make sure that that pine cone is up high enough that the stem is not past that tab. Go ahead with the leaves that have there's one that has a little notch cut out of it, and that's going to fit the stem of that pine cone. So you're going to add just a tiny bit of glue to the stem and to the top of that pine cone, and you're going to slide it right into where that leaf is. The next batch of leaves are the ones that don't have a notch in them. That's just going to go across the front of that pumpkin there. And make sure you leave room for the little stem of, I guess they're berries. I'm not really sure. A decorative greenery. And that's just going to slide in next to that set of leaves. Then when it comes to the rest of the leaves, they're going to be up to your personal preference of where you want to put them. They really don't have a specific home. The same with that last pine cone. And then these pumpkins here, they're the ones that are marked that says glue to back. So you're going to glue them so that they're sticking up higher, but you're going to glue them to the back of the long strip of pumpkins. Make sure you're holding it so that they don't slide. Do the same thing for the second set of pumpkins. They also have on the front of them, it says glue to back. That means they're going to slide right behind the front set of pumpkins so that they're up higher than the front. Hold for a couple seconds if you've got the super glue, just enough so that it holds in place. Mine didn't hold, so I'm just going to use gravity a little bit while I'm adding on the rest of my pieces. For this particular leaf, I decided to add glue to the front of the left side of my leaf. And then right there, I added a little bit of glue for the last pine cone. So the last pine cone, I'm just going to wedge down in there. And then this leaf, because I added glue to the front of it, I am going to slip it behind in between the 2 pumpkins. Just having a little leaf peeking out. Holding everything in place for a few seconds while I wait for the glue to hold. Once I feel confident that the glue is holding, I'm going to go through with a bigger brush, and it's got a stiff bristle on it. And I'm just going to take a little bit of the white paint, and I'm going to flicker it onto my pumpkins just to give them some speckling. This is completely optional. I just like the looks that it gives to it. It's hard to tell in the video, but it just gives it a nice little dimension with the speckling. So we're going to do it with white, and then I decided after I get done with the white, I was going to do just a little bit of the chocolate brown onto it. With this one, you're just going to use something that's got stiff bristles so that you can really get a good movement on the paint. Just using a tiny bit of brown, doing the same thing, and flicking it onto the front of the pumpkins. I don't really mind too much if it goes onto the leaves and the pine cones and the greenery. If you do mind, then I would suggest doing this before everything is glued together. I just like the looks that it gives to it though, so I didn't mind that it was going on all of my pieces. And once you're done with your speckling, this is what you're going to end up with. And then there is one last piece to get glued on. There's a piece called the back tab. So you're going to take that piece, and you're going to put a little bit of glue on it, and you're going to add it to the back side of the tab that's sticking out from the bottom of the pumpkins. So just add that right there. It goes right there, and it just supports it in your basket. And there you go. Thanks so much for sticking with me again for another tutorial. Can't wait to see what we have for November's. Hint, hint, it's going to be about Thanksgiving. As always, all of these projects are available for purchase on our website. It's thewanderinggooseofholland.com. And you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well.